The oral history you will be listening to will be on the Playhouse Square, captured by four incredible individuals, their recollection of what took place at the old movie theaters, the renovation of Ray Shepardson, and the Junior League.
My first experience with Playhouse Square was coming down to the Palace, which was again built in 1922. That was a vaudeville house for vaudeville shows. It was built by a man named Edward Aldie, who dedicated it to be upkey and was an entrepreneur of vaudeville, nationally known vaudevillain, who built vaudeville houses all over the United States in the 20s because it was very popular. It was on the wane, but it was still important. So the Palace was amazing because it had a really narrow stage perfect for vaudeville. After the death of vaudeville, it became a movie theaters back in the 1930s and started to show films, and gosh, there were over 3,600 seats in the Palace. Getting back to me, in 1952, This Is Cinerama was the original film that played in New York for a year, the biggest grossing film in 52. So the Palace was the designated theater for Cinerama. But in order to do that, they had to chop some of the areas on either side of the stage in order to install the giant Cinerama screen. Movies were thought of as events. They would play 10 times a week, every night at 8 p.m. And then on Wednesdays, Saturdays, and Sundays, they would play matinees. And you bought tickets like much how you do now in advance, and you were assigned a specific seat, and depending where you wanted to sit, the prices were different. So the Ohio, the State, and the Palace were all reserved seats for these engagements. In Cinerama and the Palace, they had no refreshments, there was no popcorn, Coke. People dressed up to go there, and it was considered a big major event. Then of course, after Cinerama during the 50s and 60s, when Cinerama began to wane, the theaters went back to regular showings and talk about what it was like then. You could walk into theaters in the middle of a show. The theaters opened at 11 and the film would play at 11:30. If you walked in 1:45, you could come into a middle of a film and you would then stay through it. If you came 20 minutes into the movie, for instance, you could stay and see it again and again. A number of times I sat through a number of movies. Several times in a row, you wouldn't have to move because it was so massive. The movies weren't shown only with a cartoon. It would show a newsreel, oftentimes a short subject, and they ran continuously, over and over and over again, from late morning all the way until the evening. Playhouse Square was the center of the activity, and you never worried about leaving the theater at 11 at night because it was well maintained, well policed. There was never any issues, and it was always active.
I don't know a lot of it. I know from basically conversations with my older brother, who is now going to be 74 this year. He had a lot more personal experience of it when they were all movie palaces down there. And because of his interest in film and having seen so many movies there, and it's kind of his, I don't want to say his inclination anyway. He has a lot of information on the history of all of the theaters that were there, and going back to the time when they were actually vaudeville houses. I remember my father talking about it, some of the theaters, and I don't know specifically which ones, that actually way back when in the kind of the heyday of vaudeville had like Ziegfeld Follies there, those really kind of iconic vaudeville productions. I remember fairly vividly when I was young going to see movies there, and they were always, and as they are today, because they were so beautifully restored when they were on the brink of being demolished. A gentleman came in, his name was Ray, and I can't think of his last name, but Ray Shepardson, but he initiated this fundraising project to really save Playhouse Square, and it was enormously successful. And I just remember these really beautifully stunning appointed, as they restored them very well, venues for seeing movies, and they were these big roadshow type films, like Cinerama, which was this kind of inventive, at the time progressive cinema experience where the screen was curved, so it would seem like you were actually in the movie. Just the major motion pictures. And as I said, it wasn't just like casually going to a movie. When you went down there, it was really an event. It usually involved dinner someplace, or you kind of got dressed up to go there. So that's kind of my strong memory of it. And the rest is really nurtured by my conversations with my brother.
Ray Shepardson started in the early 70s. The theaters closed in 1969. That's when Playhouse Square Association was formed, and then eventually they applied to be a nonprofit organization. PSA might have been as well, but it was just much more developed by that time. So it started with the grassroots revival, and then they started partnering up with the different community and civic leaders, government officials, both local and state. So Ray, for starters, was not a Clevelander, so he came in from Seattle, Washington, and so he was a lot more like, oh my God, look at these. These are unbelievable. These are some of the most beautiful theaters, but what was so unique about them is that they were all kind of like in a row, and they were all closed down except for the Hannah, I think, was still open. At that time, I'm trying to think of how many owners there were. I can't think of how many owners there were at that time. But because they were in danger of being torn down, because one of the owners had applied for a demolition permit to tear down the auditorium. He applied for a demolition permit, and he might have been tearing down the auditorium, but he was going to turn the lobbies and some of the space leading up to him into a parking garage. And so we have blueprints of those plans to do that. And then I think another company was going to do the same thing to the Palace Theater. They were going to keep the lobby. They were going to keep the lobby because the Palace Grand Lobby is beautiful, but then they were going to tear down the theater part, and then they were going to build the back of the hotel there where all the rooms would be. Then the parking garage would be where the theater was.
Well, from what I understand, I never knew Ray myself, but from what I understand, he was a public school employee who was in there looking for a venue to have a teachers' meeting of some kind, and was just taken aback by what he found in there and one of the big murals along the wall. He was married to a woman named Cecilia Hartman, and so she was part of the whole crew, making popcorn and setting up the tables and selling tickets. But there's a story, there's a lawyer named Pudge, I can't think of his last name, who blocked the city from allowing a curb cut to be made in Euclid. The curb cut would have allowed the area of the theaters to be bulldozed and turned into parking garages because the cars could go in there. So I don't know why they had to do the curb cut first, why they couldn't have, demolished the theaters and then as they were building the garage get the curb cut. But apparently it came up and he managed to get it blocked because it just kind of put on hold this whole parking garage business because they didn't get the curb cut passed. So it's kind of like, for want of a nail, you lost your kingdom. Well, the parking garage people, for lack of a curb cut, ultimately lost their parking garage plans. The events of Ray Shepardson and everybody subsequently overtook the idea and got the theaters saved. So that was Ray in the early step, and then Laney Haddon brought the Junior League into the picture. And the Junior League is a women's group. It's often been for young socialites or young business women who want to, back in the days when women didn't have quite the same opportunities they have now, and there's still room to improve, mind you. But, there tended to be parallel women's groups that existed, and this was a group for a well-established group. I mean, we're not, this isn't just a Cleveland thing, it's a national Junior League movement one of those things like League of Women Voters or something that you find all over the place. And so the Junior League was just a way to marshal the talents and energies of, younger professional women and causes that they might be interested in. So she was able to direct their energies on that campaign to save the theaters, and it was quite effective. So, just kind of built steam up from there. But really, if it hadn't been for Ray and his band of married men and women, Cecilia, there wouldn't have been anything to be brought back. He just kind of proved that you could get bodies into those theaters again if you tried hard enough. He was just basically proving there were audiences that would come downtown. He didn't have the means at his fingertips to actually do any heavy construction, remodeling kind of stuff.